we have with us Ron Bronson, who is a designer who helps bureaucracies navigate large-scale transformation and navigate digital products from ideation to post-launch. And with that in mind, he will be looking at the consequences and shadow sides of service design, particularly from a Touchpoints perspective, and how we can use some of these ideas to build resiliency. Welcome, Ron. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Share my screen. Cool. Well, hello, and thanks for being here today in these most natural of unnatural times, if you will. And so today we're going to talk about the consequences of service design, and I will sort of preface this talk by saying that while it is sort of, to me, a sort of aspirationally hopeful topic, I do not know that it is necessarily the most rah-rah fun topic. So this is not fun, but important nonetheless. And so I think that the genesis of this talk really is born out of an idea of thinking about being on a roller coaster. And much of, when you think about, and I'll get to sort of where this talk really came from in a second, but thinking about being on a roller coaster and this notion that so much of the work that we do, and most of my work comes sort of, just a background about me a little bit, is I work primarily on the sort of interaction design side, experience design side of this work, but I've sort of been either very directly or tangentially involved in service design pieces of this for 15 years. So I come at this in a different way. I come at this from more of a UX side of this. But when you think about where we all meet is in this world, in this place where we want people on the roller coaster. We want folks to constantly be riding the roller coaster without really a whole lot of accounting for when they're going to get off, or when they get off, really understanding why that's an okay thing to do. And so if you think about that for a second, so this talk actually born out of a tweet, like many good things in the world and also many bad things come from Twitter. And the question really was sort of born out of COVID. I was thinking about, so many systems that everything is designed. So many of these things are designed with the idea that people have good intentions, that we mean well, that everyone, that we take our framing, our frames, our ideas, and we graft that onto other people's intentions or our own intentions of what it is that we're trying to do, for ill or for nil. And in a world like COVID, looking at the ways that, like walking down my street, I live in Portland, Oregon, and walking down my street and seeing businesses being closed, or seeing restaurants that used to be open, seeing the really vibrant areas no longer that way, or seeing ways that people, businesses and individuals were adapting to this new world, sort of rapidly taking information in and changing things, going into supermarkets and seeing, placards on the floor to tell you which way to walk. Thinking about this made me think about many of the ways that we build and design artifacts, the way we create in service design, and think about how while we think about what could go wrong, much of the assumption that goes into the work that we do is born of this idea that everyone's experience with a service, with an experience, with a product is going to be ideal. It's going to be the same. And when things go wrong, it could be their fault, or that wasn't supposed to happen. That's not what we intended to have happen. But what happens when the entire world is that way? And that's what this talk is born out of. So I've been giving a talk over the last couple of years, talking about more on the interaction design of this, talking about things like hostile design and thinking about sort of anti-patterns in UX. You get a pop-up ad on a site that you weren't intending for, or friction on a site or in an experience or an app or a product that wasn't supposed to be there, or you subscribe to a thing, you don't want to use it anymore, but you've got to call 8 people to get unsubscribed from this thing that you're paying money for, even though it was really simple and easy, frictionless for you to sign up. So thinking about all these negative things. But it started with a train kiosk. And so I was in Chicago a bunch of years ago, and I bought my ticket online, and I missed the train. So I'm waiting for this later train, and I'm watching people interact with a train kiosk. It's not this one, it was a different one. I didn't know to take a picture of it at the time. And watching folks interact with this, and it occurred to me that every person, young, old, didn't matter. They'd have folks who worked there come help them, had a problem with this kiosk. The UI was just a mess. And so I'm looking at that, I'm like, surely it can't be that difficult. I mean, how hard could it possibly be? It's just a train kiosk, you're buying a ticket. What's going on? But I saw every person struggle. So finally, after, I told you I had time to kill. So after an hour or so watching this play out and be longer, I went up to it because I'm like, surely I can figure this out. I do this all the time. I build these kinds of things. I'm going to nail this. These folks are just silly. It's really easy. And even with this thing narrating at me, which was actually really, really offensive, it just shouts at you. It turns out it was not easy for me to use at all. And it was just all these really bad decisions that were made. And so it occurred to me, and this is, like I said, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, maybe longer. I asked the question, who designs this stuff? Who tests these things? Who's making these decisions? And why is it not important? And so when you think about every problem, I frame design problems, or at least I used to frame design problems, in saying that every problem is a design problem. I'm talking about things that are not just in terms of service design, or just in terms of interaction design, or just in terms of content or other kinds of design, but thinking more about problem spaces and how even in real world experiences, which we don't often try to policy design, policies that happen in real life often infuse the ways that we build things in the digital world or in services. Victor Papanet's book, Design for the Real World from 1971 has this really great graphic that many of you have seen before. But design, we like to think that if we just had the bottom part, we could just, you give us everything, control, if there are more service designers, so it'd all be solved, we could fix it, it would all be done. We'd work collaboratively and it would get done. The reality is less clear than that. The actual problems are much bigger. Our share of the problem is much smaller. And once we realize that, better things start to happen, because recognize that the problems that we're trying to graft solutions on problems that in many cases predate the work that we're trying to do, predate the technologies that we're using. In some cases, we're grafting UI layers on top of real problems, hoping that's going to solve it. And as we many times we know that doesn't work. And so the more I worked on this, the more I thought about the reality here is that every problem is really a research problem. We're not taking the time to dig into the issues. And this isn't just like the kind of research you're thinking about, iterative design research. I'm talking more about problem spaces, talking more about stress cases. I'm talking more about edge cases. The people that we consider to be the problems, the folks we considered outside of the framing of who we think is using the thing, the service, the tool, the product. And again, I'm talking a lot in products because it's kind of where I work, but just extrapolate that to whatever you're working on, whether it's a service or a thing, a place, whatever. So it's less about doing research, the research you're already doing, maybe doing well, maybe you could do better, but thinking about the folks that you do not implicitly think about as your target audience, as your core audience, and recognizing that in many cases, these individuals actually are your target audience or are your core audience, but because you want aspirationally to reach out to someone else, because there are other reasons that you may want to target different groups, this may not be as much of the focus. And so when you think about people being in line to reach a thing, what are the limits of service design? We tend to, and part of the reason I was willing to do this talk, I took a talk that I've been doing for years and tried to shorten it and condense it or whatever else. But the reason I wanted to do this is because in the States, service design is still something that is still kind of, emergent, if you will. And so to get in a world where people are talking about this, to get together with a group of service designers, to me, was exciting because I think there's a lot of opportunity. Whenever I go to Europe, I recognize there's a ton of opportunity, in terms of the work that's been done, being done, and been implemented in other places that here we're not, in some ways it tends to be very focused from a business perspective or a financial perspective and not framed from a people-centric perspective. But more importantly, what are the limits of the work that we're doing? Where, as much as we think it has capacity to help, to aid, to move things forward, to bridge gaps, to improve experiences, what are the limits of the framing? Products aren't innocent. This is an article I can tweet it out later, but we tend to think that oh, well, the experience is agnostic and we're just building for everyone. Everyone can use this. But the reality of that is, much of what you've heard today is that people experience these services, people experience experiences in many different ways based on where they're coming from, based on the timing, based on their experiences, and so forth. And if we don't frame the work that we're doing, instead of just thinking of front stage and backstage, everyone's front stage experience is different based on what they're coming to you as. And I don't just mean, oh, they're a preferred user who comes in a particular kind of lane. I just mean individuals in general, but we don't have these conversations in the front end enough. Much of what we talk about, at least in the interaction design side of this, is, oh, we just need to be more empathetic. We need ethics. We just need to give people more tools to be able to see it from someone else's perspective. Living in this world, if you don't already realize the flaws in that framing, empathy isn't going to solve this. And the reason it doesn't solve it is because it presupposes that we all frame empathy the same way, that we all want the same ends and the same outcomes. And so when you talk about consequences, and again, a larger version of this talk talks about where when you're talking about consequences, the thought you start and where you begin is to think about the end state. What does the ideal state look like? Let's work backwards from the ideal state and figure out why that is the ideal state. Why do we arrive there? Who was involved in that conversation? Who was involved in the thinking of that ideal state? And then figuring out who was missing from those conversations, who's missing from that sort of framed audience in our heads. And then figuring out from there how to, in some cases, rebuild, reimagine the experiences, the things that we're developing, the things that we're designing, and so forth. And so when you think about a service experience, you think about, again, thinking about the hotel experience and walking in for the first time into the grand halls of whatever, not now, but in general, though some of us probably are, but most of us are not going places like we used to be. Every single individual touch point that's conceived, everything you build, there are presumptions and there's framing built into this that may or may not actually bear witness to the people who are using the things that you do every day. And so what I've tried to do over the last couple of, like I said, over the last year or two, is to start to try to delineate where there are not just frictions, and again, in interaction design, thinking about some of the things that go wrong, highlighting these patterns that are bad, hostile, for instance, and then giving names to some of the things that are actually happening in these things. Because part of the reason we're not able to talk about this, part of the reason that I'm sure you know that there are problems in the different things that you're making or whatever else, or you're highlighting, you're tagging these, flagging these things, but you're not able to work on it. It's because we don't have common language for things like, myopia, or we don't have good language for things like different kinds of friction, thinking about coercive friction. Like, we have to say, just like other industries have, rules and guidelines and frameworks for the things that are okay and the things that are not okay. And there are folks who operate outside of those bounds, but they may be shunned for that. Or maybe there are regulatory reasons for that. I'm not one that advocates for the latter, of like creating some sort of weird bar association for designers. You will never hear me say that. We'll get into that another time. I don't have time for that rant. But thinking about the ways that we use friction wielding it as a tool of negativity. I want friction when I don't want you in my bank account, because that would be less than ideal. Or when you're getting into my house or my building or whatever else. Friction may be less of an issue when I want to unsubscribe from a thing that I'm done using. I've appreciated the time that I had it. It's not always a negative thing that someone wants to stop doing a thing. Someone dies, they need to stop using your thing, but we don't necessarily assume that. We want to keep people on the funnel, keep them on the roller coaster. What we cannot do is continue to abdicate responsibility for the harm that gets baked in the things and experiences that we create. When people tell us something is wrong, whether it's once, whether it's 100 times, we need to be documenting these things, but more importantly, figuring out the root causes of where the harm is so that the harm is no longer there. There'll be other things that happen, but the only ways we can be responsive to this stuff is to acknowledge that these are problems and not to pass the buck or to pass the blame. Using guilt as a retention strategy is another, guilt friction is another example of the kinds of things that we don't have good words for, we don't have good names for. This is an example of an email I got from a barber that I don't live in this town anymore. He can't cut my hair because I don't live there. We didn't break up. It was not a relationship. We were not best friends. He's a nice guy. He did not send this email. The app that he uses for me to sign up for appointments sent this email. They always use this language. I know because other barbers that I've had in other places who use this app also send the same "I miss you" email. He did not know this email was being sent in his name. That is a problem because we don't talk that way to each other. It seems benign, but we do this every day. And the bigger issue is when you have 100 of these emails rather than just one. One I can deal with. When you have 100 from different brands, different services, we had one interaction one time, and now that entitles you to reach out to me for the next 25 years? I don't think so. But we seem to think that's okay. We seem to think that we've created this environment and this world, and where we've decided to drive onto the on-ramp. Maybe we didn't create the problems. We've driven onto the on-ramp of this problem space, and we just enable it because we presume that, well, that's just where it is. That's just how it goes. It doesn't have to operate that way. We just presume that it does. It's a really good article from Real Life Magazine, which I really enjoy, talking about some of the whimsy of unsubscribed messages and the ways we use guilt to trivialize people's everyday experiences. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with thinking in services. Very dense, very heavy, but really great. And really great thinking about the kinds of ways I think we need hundreds of books like this. Not that dense necessarily, but able for us to start to think about how we unravel services, how we unravel and grow the systems that we're building in ways that allow us to get to root causes of problems and not just to graft sort of the real world policy failures onto services and to real world experiences, because that's all we have. Lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about liminality. One of the other things is that I think the reason that so many experiences fail is that so many of the things that happen are transition states. If you think about small interactions within bigger interactions, this is a really trivial thing, but modals between onboarding experiences. Maybe somebody owns onboarding, but they don't own the interactions between it. Thinking about more real life experiences, you're at the grocery store, thinking about different parts of that experience and where certain things may not go from one point to another because somebody doesn't own that particular experience. And you say, well, we can't hire enough people to do that. The questions we need to ask ourselves is, whose job is it to own those transition states? And more importantly, whose job is it to humanely deal with closure and to respect people's decisions, to respect offboarding as just as important, maybe more important than onboarding? And with that, that's all. This is definitely, like I said, a condensed version of a talk that I've been sort of giving for a while, but I just wanted to sort of run in and give you a lot to think about. Since it was more, I wanted to say in the beginning, it's more of a questions talk than an answers talk. But with that's I'll pass the ball back. I don't know how we're doing this back to Marina.